What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and today on the Homebrewed Christianity podcast, we not only begin the 11th year of Homebrewed Christianity. That's right, for 11 years. We've been bringing you the ideological ingredients to brew some zesty thoughts and imaginative explorations. But we bring you Dr. Karl Giberson, physicist, public intellectual, regular public intellectual who engages the intersections of religion and science. This is a continuation of our series on religion and science that we kicked off a couple episodes ago with Ted Peters. And today, hanging out with a physicist, we're going to talk about creation, creation out of nothing, physics, fine-tuning, the multiverse, whether or not that makes sense. We're going to talk about Lawrence Krauss and his engagement with him. We're going to talk about quantum goodness. He doesn't actually use the phrase quantum goodness. I was mostly meaning it's good to talk about quantum stuff because, that just sounds like a lot of fun. But also, what it's like as a scientist who leaves an evangelical context and then takes a look back at their resistance to science literacy and really engaging the science and getting hung up on specific issues that are just difficult to deal with, like, a literal Adam and Eve or something like that. And I think you're going to have yourself a good time. I had a blast talking with Karl. I really am glad Tom Ward told me that I had to talk to him. And I hope you enjoy this episode as much as me. When you do, and you go look and realize just how many different books he has written, a couple to think of, checking out first is his one of his newer books I really enjoyed was Saving the Original Sinner: How Christians Have Used the Bible's First Man to Oppress, Inspire, and Make Sense of the World. He has a book called The Wonder of the Universe that looks at cosmology, physics, fine-tuning, and such. A book called Abraham's Dice: Chance and Providence in the Monotheistic Traditions. And a book called Seven Glorious Days, where he, as a physicist, retells the Genesis creation story and connects it and informs it with a cosmological account of the universe. If you want to read what he was up to before exiting the evangelical context, he was more explicitly engaging it in a book called Saving Darwin: How to Be a Christian and Believe in Evolution. And it's a great book, especially if this whole topic is new. Great place to begin. But before we hop into this episode, which is a lot of fun and a continuation of the religion science conversations I've been recording, just a couple weeks ago we talked to Ted Peters. I want to just invite everyone, if you're listening, to join the Open and Relational Theology reading group. All you got to do is go to openandrelationaltheology.com. We're just kicking it off. It's going to run all the way through Lent. And in fact, if you're listening to this later, you can go to that website, openandrelational.com, and join the group later. You'll get all the videos of each week's session, our reading materials, the MP3s, if you want to listen instead of watch. And you'll get invited into the discussion group where you can always interact with everybody who is in the class, has been in the class before, connect with other theology nerds that are asking, what is it like to wrestle with a God who's genuinely open and invested in the world and acting and related to it? We cover a whole bunch of different thinkers, including John Polkinghorne, Sir John Polkinghorne, physicist and priest, who comes up in this conversation. If you want to connect with me, make sure you head to tripfuller.com. That's right, tripfuller.com with 2 P's. That's my name. And you'll find out access to all the different podcasts, different groups we do, and all that kind of exciting goodies. And if you are sitting there and you're like, I want the podcast, Homebrewed Christianity, to happen at my church, at my school, with my group, holler at me. And if you want me to come speak and all that kind of stuff, you can connect with me there at tripfuller.com. All right, here we go. It's time for Dr. Karl Giberson. Enjoy. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and I am here with Karl Giberson, who is a scientist, a professor at Stonehill, and a recently annexed evangelical. Now he's hanging out with a lot of Catholics, teaching science and such. He's the author of Saving Darwin, Abraham's Dice, Saving the Original Sinner, and a whole bunch of other books because, you got to do something with your fingers. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, happy to be here.
So one of the things that I thought that might help kind of set the stage for this conversation is, recently you departed from Eastern Nazarene University, but even teaching science there was quite a journey from your kind of fundamentalist Canadian upbringing. Can you kind of tell us the story of how you saw faith and science relating early in your life that brought you to being an advocate of science and evangelicalism?
Yeah, I was raised in a pretty conservative, very kind of ordinary fundamentalist church, but it was, as I like to say, Canadian fundamentalism, which is a kinder, gentler version that is defined more by a kind of fidelity to a literal reading of the scripture than it is by kind of hostile opposition to all things liberal, which seems to be the American ethos for fundamentalism. My father was a Baptist pastor, and I read the Bible daily, memorized portions of it, and so on. And then as a teenager, I got interested in science, and I pursued it largely by reading creationist literature, and there were only there were plenty of fundamentalists through my father's work that were happy to pass on creationist literature to me, and so I got kind of drawn into science through that particular doorway, which kind of opens up the world of science as something to be feared and opposed if you were a serious Christian. And so my sort of formative interest in science pushed me in the direction of wanting to debunk it and replace it with the sort of correct, more biblically based science. And like creationists today, I was raised to believe that the secular scientific enterprise was somewhat of a sham. It was a kind of a futile exercise to try to build an explanation for origins that did not require God. So anyway, that's kind of worldview focus and so on was the way I arrived at Eastern Nazarene College in Boston in 1975. And I was more or less of a mind to think that kind of all Christians or all real Christians thought the way that I did. And I was somewhat horrified to discover that Eastern Nazarene College was not a fundamentalist institution, that the biology department taught evolution, that the biblical studies folk didn't take the Bible literally. Some of them didn't believe in Adam and Eve. I had a philosophy professor that didn't believe in the devil. And right, so it was my first exposure to kind of a moderate, or maybe what we would even say a liberal evangelicalism. It wasn't Christian liberalism, but it was certainly a very liberal form of evangelicalism. And I was quite uncomfortable with that for all of my freshman year and into my sophomore year. But then in the middle of my first philosophy class as a sophomore, like something kind of cracked in my worldview, and all of that kind of came crashing down. And I became convinced that this view of science in particular was just indefensible. And I think a part of that was driven by the fact that people like Newton and Galileo and Einstein and so on were becoming like my heroes. And like the thought that these sort of grand thinkers with their extraordinary imaginations and diligent search for the truth, that they were really part of some big conspiracy that was being kind of orchestrated by Satan to pull people away from the Bible, seemed an increasingly implausible and eventually a preposterous idea. So I became kind of a crusader on the other side, being most concerned about the way that I had been kind of brainwashed as a young person, interfering kind of conventional science and so on. And then because it was an evangelical context, and I had thinkers around me who were comfortable with their religious faith but not inclined to reject science, I was kind of nurtured into that more liberal view. But it never became entirely comfortable for me. Like, I continued to wrestle with it for my entire life, and like my books in many ways kind of reflect the kind of lifelong journey that I've had as I've tried to figure out exactly how one takes science seriously while maintaining some religious faith.
So how would you describe your experience of faith in that quest? Because I think a lot of people today are encountering that initial conflict, that initial separation from the account of faith they were handed, and their initial encounter with the scientific picture of the world, and it's experienced as either or. And I wonder what you've learned about how to negotiate that boundary as a person of faith while preserving your doubts, questions, and things along the journey.
Well, I think that's an extremely good question. I mean, and in many ways, that's the central question that the people who are kind of working in the area where I, until very recently, have worked are engaged. I mean, the young people everywhere in the evangelical church are raised to believe a certain set of things, which at some point in early adulthood they abandon, and sometimes it's even earlier than that. Like, questions of gay marriage and so on are things which people get very uncomfortable at age 13. Now, evolution is likely to be, more age 19 or something, but you come into a world where things that you have been told are not just true, but are true in a way that they have to be defended vigorously when you discover that those things are just wrong. I think what evangelicals are teaching about evolution, the Big Bang, gay marriage, and so on, they're just wrong. They're not open to interpretation, and so on. So when you encounter these central religious ideas that you now feel compelled to reject, you either have to sift through all of the different religious ideas that you have and pick and choose ones that you're comfortable with, or you just reject the whole thing. And, as demographic studies are showing, young people are choosing the latter and rejecting the whole thing increasingly now. And I think that bodes ill for the future of Christianity in America, certainly conservative Christianity. So for me, one of the things that sustained me and to some degree was a significant part of my spiritual journey until quite recently was the fact that the faith communities of which I were a part were very nurturing and appealing and kind of very, very happy familial places for me. The church that I grew up in, despite being populated by farmers and mechanics and a lot of people that didn't even have high school diplomas, much less college degrees, like, they were wonderful people, and they were not reading the Bible to find ammunition against any local political issue, and so on. They were people who, if you came upon hard times, they were there for you. And I had a lot of experiences growing up that still to this day are very moving when I recall them. I mean, I recall a large rural family that had, I think there was like 9 kids, something like that, and their house burned to the ground in the middle of the winter. And they were suddenly homeless. They were poor. And the people in my church, kind of without getting any official permissions, took over an abandoned schoolhouse that nobody had been using for a long time. And because everybody is related to everybody else in these rural communities, they knew that, oh, well, the authorities won't make a fuss about this. But they dug trenches and ran water to this schoolhouse and put insulation in it and got a wood stove running. I mean, they just made this heroic effort in the middle of the winter to house this rather large family. And donations came in at such a pace that they had to put announcements out on the radio, please stop donating to this family. And, so those kinds of things where these people kind of were carrying out the teachings of Jesus at the highest level and making personal sacrifices and so on for each other. Like, there was a kind of community there that I wanted to be a part of, even when I didn't share all of the beliefs. And when I would go home, even after I had kind of become more liberal, like, I would still go see those people and be so happy to be in their homes and back in the pew beside them there. So the idea of being in a community was very sustaining for me. And so the community that I grew up in was one that I never wanted to reject it as narrow-minded and political and hostile to knowledge. I always wanted to embrace it as full of wonderful people who embody the best teachings of Jesus. And to a lesser degree, but still in a very meaningful way, Eastern Nazarene College was the same kind of community for me. I mean, it was filled with wonderful people that I liked. And I started teaching there in 1984, which was shortly before the religious right became so obnoxious. So the idea of an evangelical community full of wholesome people that are searching for the truth, that are doing social justice work and so on was very, very important to me. So a part of my motivation to continue in my faith, to retain religious beliefs, was because I was a part of a community where those beliefs were central. And my job at Eastern Nazarene, required that I remain faithful to the theological statement of faith. So there was a lot of practical motivation there, but there was also a deeply personal sense that I wanted to be a part of that kind of community. And when Eastern Nazarene began to undergo its kind of conversion to a more right-wing kind of institution, as fundamentalists became more powerful and finances became tight enough that you couldn't afford to not pay attention to fundamentalists who were putting pressure on you and so on. Like, when the institution transformed that way, like, I became increasingly alienated from that community, and then eventually the tensions were such that I just felt like, okay, I can't continue. I can't continue here anymore. Now, there were a lot of other issues involved in that as well, but that was the first time in my spiritual journey that I kind of like wanted to walk away from the community. And I now look back on evangelicalism, at least as it's constituted in the United States today, as a negative community, not a positive one. And I became very intentional about not wanting anybody to mistakenly think that I was an evangelical. And with my background and having written as much as I did and worked at an evangelical college for a quarter century, it was very natural for people to assume that I was an evangelical. And so I became quite intentional about distancing myself. And when I would get asked to contribute a chapter to a book about evangelical perspectives on this or that, like, I would make it quite clear that, like, I reject the label evangelical and so on, but I will comment on this question that you've asked me to comment on. And I think, I mean, in some ways, the most important transition, most important kind of catalyst maybe for that was when Michelle Bachmann was running for president. Like, I looked at Michelle Bachmann and I just thought, like I don't identify with her faith at all. It doesn't resonate in the least with me. I couldn't imagine worshiping with her. I don't want anybody to think for 1 second that I am in the same faith tradition that she is. And so that was kind of when I started to push back a lot on the label. And I guess now there's now a label for people like me, ex-evangelicals or something. I don't know how long that's been around, but I just encountered it recently.
Well, Twitter comes up with ways of labeling things, and whichever ones are popular stick on the as hashtags. Well, and I think that the label evangelical, at least my experience from college on it's been a contested one, but the shift of late is a growing number of people who have invested lots of time in trying to keep the space broad, and things are walking away. And they're not walking away because they're walking away because they're just so disappointed and the fruits of the tradition itself.
Yes, I mean that's I think we look at the community of evangelicals and we say what is that group doing as a community, and the answer no longer is feeding the hungry and clothing those without clothes and housing the homeless and so on. The answer is putting Donald Trump in the White House, erecting barriers to immigration, cutting social services, and so on. And the collection of beliefs that define evangelicalism now, I think, are really better understood as a collection of political positions than religious ones. And I think in the political positions, evangelicalism, for the most part, has almost no overlap with the teachings of Jesus any longer.
Yeah, and in what we most of the time the word evangelicals used, we mean white evangelicals.
Yes.
In the United States, because as you pointed out, Canadian evangelicals can have all sorts of doctrines that are similar and not have tyrannical political ideas.
Yeah, and I mean the same with British evangelicals. I mean, some of the great sort of heroes from Britain, N.T. Wright and John Polkinghorne, who, he's quite insistent that he's not an evangelical, but he's an evangelical hero among moderates in the United States and so on. I mean, they hold beliefs that are quite, that would be unacceptable at a lot of American evangelical colleges, for example. Like N.T. Wright, for example, couldn't teach at Liberty or at, Bob Jones or Bryan College, and some of the Nazarene schools wouldn't hire someone like N.T. Wright and so on. So American evangelicalism has become almost indistinguishable from fundamentalism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wonder for now in graduate school and stuff, you started in physics, right?
Yes,
and
finished in physics.
I meant like the first book that puts you on my radar has Darwin on the front of it, and you're a physicist. So, when you think of the questions in that the big questions humanity has always asked that are connected to the study of physics, like which ones are the ones you're most attracted to now, and are they different, or do you have different answers than you had when you first started?
Well, I mean, physics has always gotten along a lot better with religion than biology, and when they do surveys of religious belief and so on, you're more likely to encounter theists in physics than you are in biology. Some of that, I think, is because physics is just harder, and so people don't understand it, and it's maybe difficult to kind of dispute against something that just overwhelms you, whereas Darwin's theory is relatively simple to understand, and everybody that reads 5 pages from some fundamentalists about it thinks that they fully get it. But in physics, I'm very intrigued by a number of deep questions. I mean, the laws of physics don't explain themselves, and the world has at its foundation some kind of deeply rational character, and I think that rational character is very provocative. I think it's very suggestive. I don't think it constitutes necessarily a knockdown argument for the existence of God, but I think it brings questions about the existence of some kind of transcendent rational origin to the universe kind of onto the radar in a legitimate way. And there aren't very many, there aren't very many people who just dismiss that. Even the kind of crusaders in the new atheist movement don't dismiss that question the way they would dismiss creationism. Creationism is a preposterous idea. The idea that there's some kind of mysterious rationality at the foundation of reality is not a preposterous idea at all. So I'm very intrigued by that. And then this rationality is not just a sort of particular set of reasonable statements about the world. It's a rationality which has enabled the universe to bring forth life, and that's a very interesting byproduct of the laws of physics. And you can look at these laws of nature and see how they are finely tuned in such a way that the universe just grows ever more complex as time progresses. That there's a mechanism that takes a universe that's composed kind of exclusively of hydrogen and kind of builds all the elements of the periodic table. Right? There's mechanisms that take amorphous clouds of material and turn them into solar systems, and so on. So all of these processes give the universe a very interesting kind of narrative history. And so I've explored these ideas in two books. In my book with InterVarsity Press called The Wonder of the Universe, I kind of looked at this, and then I did a book with it was my first book with the Catholic press that just by coincidence kind of coincided with my moving to a Catholic institution. But it was called 7 Glorious Days. And I kind of rewrote the Genesis creation story as if it was based on modern science, but I used kind of biblical language and divided the universe into 7 epochs and so on. It was meant to be an imaginative work, not a work of apologetics. But then I also recast the scientific story as if it was itself also a narrative, and that each chapter was something that followed from the previous chapter and was the foundation for the subsequent chapter, and so on, kind of showing that a universe that has life in it like ours needs to have a whole lot of very interesting things that happen before you get there. So the laws of physics, I think, are it's a bottomless well of mystery. Mm-hmm. And there's so much interesting exploration you can do by reflecting on that question about why they have the rational character that they do, and then an equally fascinating question: why are our brains that evolved on the grasslands of Africa to solve rather different problems capable of fathoming this mystery? I mean, how is it that we can do calculus? Like, why are our brains capable of writing down the equations of the hydrogen atom and solving them? I mean, it takes years and years and years to learn enough math to do that. So, I mean, you can hardly argue that, oh, well, this was an important skill on the grasslands of Africa to be able, to solve differential equations, and so on. But yeah, we've got these minds that are capable of doing that. So there's just a lot of mystery there, and I think it's very provocative, very engaging, very stimulating to kind of ponder that.
So one of the things that strikes me, especially when thinking through questions around physics and kind of the bigger human or philosophical questions that come up around it, is really connected to that notion. You said that you tried to capture the story of science or the scientific picture of the world in a narrative form. That when scientists or philosophers of science start trying to articulate a big picture, they either end up embracing a narrative form, which tends towards something like, fine-tuning and some type of affirmation of ultimate rationality, or set the narrative landscape in something like a multiverse or something like that, where the constants that are generative of complexity, life, and the emergence and everything that takes place in the cosmic narrative, is one among millions of options, and we just happen to be by happenstance in this one. Like how would you advise those of us who aren't really fundamentalists but are people of faith to make sense of the kind of growing interest in this popular debate among physics and philosophers?
Yeah, so I'll just put my cards on the table. I'm very skeptical of the multiverse. Now, some of my skepticism might be that it's kind of mind-boggling and so on, but lots of things in physics are mind-boggling. I'm skeptical of the multiverse because the context in which some of its champions, at least, promote it is precisely, as you mentioned, to kind of do away with the question of fine tuning. That we live in a remarkably well-designed universe, and we either have to account for that design in some way, or we invoke the idea that there's kind of a random generator of universes, and if you generate enough universes, you get one that will look like this, and so on. And so our remarkable universe ends up being no more remarkable than the fact that some guy wins the lottery after several years and is a multimillionaire, and so on. And wasn't he lucky that his numbers came up there? But we don't consider the lottery winner remarkable because he coexists with a vast universe of people that didn't win the lottery, and so on. And someone had to win. So, you make that argument, the fine-tuning argument. It's very familiar now. But I think the fine-tuning argument glosses too quickly over a number of problems. It's based on physics, which hasn't been completely confirmed. So, like all of the string theory stuff that is the foundation that's not sort of mainstream, central, broadly accepted physics at this point. Now, lots of smart people think that it's true, and it may very well turn out to be true, but it's been around quite a while, and it still has not managed to generate testable predictions and so on, so that we have to keep it still in a somewhat hypothetical category. So, that's a concern. The multiverse enthusiasts also overlook the fact that the multiverse generator that they claim is responsible for everything has to be of a particular form. Like it has to be such that it generates all possibilities, and we don't really have a compelling reason to think that it would take that form. If for example, every multiverse generator was such that the charge on the electron always turned out to be exactly what it is in our universe, well, that would put constraints on all the other parts of the universe. Would put constraints on how strong gravity had to be, and so on, because these things all interlock in interesting ways. And so you have to kind of work out some rationale for assuming that the multiverse generator doesn't predominantly spit out one type of universe and rather spits out all of them. And then there's a very basic question that has to do with the way you move back and forth between mathematics and physics in questions like this. The physics enterprise is dominated by trying to figure out a way to write a mathematical equation that corresponds to reality. Most famous would be Newton's law of gravity, where you plug in the mass of the sun, you plug in the mass of the Earth, you plug in the distance between them, and it tells you how fast the Earth will move at a certain orbital distance, and so on. But mathematics and physics, they're not the same thing. And John Archibald Wheeler, who thought a lot about these questions, he once did the sort of thought experiment where he said, like, imagine that you are walking about in a room and there are these tiles everywhere, and on the tiles are written all the equations of physics, and every imaginable equation that covers every possible thing is there in front of you. and then you stand there and you call upon those equations to produce the universe. He said nothing is going to happen, right? This is mathematics. This is not physics. Like, there has to be something that kind of brings life. What Katie Ferguson calls the fire in the equations. There has to be some fire that comes out of these equations. So when we create a mathematical equation, it can sometimes be extraordinarily descriptive of a physical process, but mathematical equations often have solutions that don't correspond to real things. And when I teach this in my classes, like I put a square on the board, and I tell the students that the square has an area of 4. How long is the side? And the students all say, "Oh, well, it's just 2, right?" And well, how do you get 2? And they say, "Well, you take the square root of 4." And like, I push them and challenge them a little bit, and I say, "Well, but the square root of 4 isn't just 2." And then eventually some students will say, "Oh, yeah, -2 is also a square root of 4." But it doesn't make any sense to suppose that a square could have a side of length -2. So we just throw that part of the equation away, right? So this is a part of doing mathematical physics, to solve equations, look at all the solutions, hopefully find one or more that might actually correspond to reality. And physicists are very useful. And you start doing this in high school. Like, you learn how to throw away solutions to equations that aren't real, that don't correspond to things. And so when we talk about the multiverse, like, yes, we've got this equation, and this set of equations, and one of the solutions is our universe. Okay, great. Here's a set of equations that helps us understand our universe. And then here's all these other equations. Well, how do we know those other equations correspond to actual universes? I mean, we've learned, since our mother's knee, so to speak, that mathematical solutions often don't correspond to physical reality. So the multiverse requires the assumption that all of these other equations actually correspond to real things. Now, that may very well be true, but I would like to see some empirical evidence for that before I just plant my flag there and say, okay, this is the nature of reality.
So now I did in graduate school, I did religion and philosophy, but read large volumes of Alfred North Whitehead, which leads to hanging out with people that across disciplines that like Whitehead when you're in Claremont. And they had a physics gathering, and there were physicists from all different kind of schools of thought. And I went out drinking with a multiverse theorist. We don't have to name his name because he's rather popular. And he was explaining this to me. And this was my response, but I was like, I don't know how to decide this. But the multiverse, to me, and especially the way you describe it, sounds like the mathematical process is a type of abstraction from reality used to gauge, to reflect on reality. And the multiverse is an affirmation that all the kind of possibilities that that in other times and other use of math you would discard as kind of debris in the mathematical abstraction. You would rather call all those possibilities adjacent realities than deal with the consequences philosophically for the uniqueness or particularity of one actuality, namely our universe. And I told him I couldn't see a huge difference between what he's explaining mathematically to me, between that and Aquinas's understanding of the divine mind that had every possible reality in it, except that God chose this reality to invest in this God-world relationship.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
And so, like, I say that just because, as someone who very sad, stopped taking science classes because I was good at it in high school and was a humanities person. That's depressing that so many Christians will hear this guy write a book about how he's explained creation out of nothing. And it's all connected to what's seemingly a philosophical decision that's not necessitated by the math at all.
Yeah, and that's the concern that I have, and I think that science has achieved its success and the respect that it has culturally, in large part because it's extraordinarily conservative. It has tended to be cautious. It's tended to demand evidentiary support for things when the data don't let you make up your mind. You keep both options open until you figure out a resolution and so on. There's a kind of intellectual humility in science where you draw conclusions cautiously, and it takes a long time until you get a consensus. And then even with well-established science like Newtonian mechanics, you recognize that, like, it's probably provisional, and it turns out it was provisional, and it was replaced by Einstein's theory of relativity there. So there's a kind of intellectual humility there that I think is missing from some of these champions. And I think I know who you're talking about. Maybe it'd be okay for me to just mention that I reviewed Larry Krauss's book, Creation Out of Nothing, in the Huffington Post. And and I was very critical of the fact that he's using this phrase that comes out of the Christian tradition, creation ex nihilo, and yet he's redefining nothing in a way that even an elementary philosophy student after one class in metaphysics would know better than to define nothing in that way. I mean, there's no way that nothing can be the quantum vacuum seething with virtual particles and so on. I mean, that's not nothing. That is clearly something there. So the fact that polemicists eager to kind of push religion out of culture by claiming that science accounts for all the deep questions now, the fact that they're so careless and incautious and reckless now in their pronouncements, I think does not bode well for the role of science in our culture. And I think that the culture wars over science are only going to get stronger because of people, like Larry Krauss in cosmology, like Richard Dawkins in biology, and so on. I mean, they like the sweeping, confident assertions they make that go way beyond the data are quite troubling.
And it's not. I mean, to me, it doesn't seem that necessary. Like Krauss is similar in some ways to someone like Sean Carroll, but when I read Sean, he's like much more aware of where his science ends and begins and what his kind of larger bets are on. Is something like that. Does that make sense? Like, I feel like there's a way of, and maybe it's because the church obviously has spent 2 centuries doing this, where you get to a conclusion and make a statement with a level of confidence that later you could end up embarrassed about, and the finality of a pronouncement when it's undermined later could actually lead people to doubt or question the genuine reality you were always seeking and relating to.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly right. I mean, there is a certain sense in which there's a kind of like tendency to move in the direction of orthodoxy, in science and so on, and to turn what used to be regarded as provisional truths into creeds. And I mean, that's largely what the new atheists are trying to do. And I'm less critical of them than I used to be, because I've really come to appreciate just how strong the anti-scientific and anti-intellectual sentiments are in the broad American culture and in evangelicalism in particular. So I can understand why they want to vigorously defend science, but in defending it so vigorously, they have politicized it, and now you kind of have to sign on to this orthodoxy, or you're some kind of an outsider. And I mean, I've had a very interesting career as someone who has tried to kind of keep a foot in both camps. And so I, like Jerry Coyne and I are, for example, public sparring partners, and he's written a lot of things about me, many negative, some positive, and I've written similar things about him. We're kind of offline friends in a way. So, I mean, he and I, let me put it this way. Jerry Coyne finds me to be kind of inexplicable, because in the culture war in which science finds itself today, you tend to either be waving the flag for science, triumphing over religion, or you're waving the flag against science. And the idea that somebody might be trying to maintain space for faith at the same time that they are a champion of science is incomprehensible. And so people like myself, and I'm far from unique. You get shot at from both sides. I mean, like you would think that it would be possible for the fundamentalists to say, well, Giberson is too accepting of science, but at least he believes in God, and the new atheist to say, well, Giberson is way too religious for me, but at least he endorses science. But it's just the reverse, that I'm sort of despised by evangelicals because I am not a fundamentalist and I accept science, and I'm despised by the scientific community because I maintain some space for religion, and there's kind of no room in there. Now that's hyperbolic language, and I don't mean to generalize it kind of in that way, but it's the same kind of problem that Francis Collins has had. I mean, Francis Collins, had people. I mean, Larry Krauss was one of them. Just saying he has no business as a religious believer to be head of the NIH because religious beliefs are not compatible with science. Well, I mean, it just seems preposterous to declare that somehow there's something wrong with Francis Collins, that he can't be a good scientist, considering all of his contributions and so on that he's made. So there's a kind of oxymoronic character, I think, to people of faith who want to be champions of science.
Mm-hmm. So when, as a physicist and interacting with students who bring all sorts of different kind of assumptions about science, philosophy, spirituality, and stuff in, I imagine physics is the discipline in science where people can go all sorts of different directions, right? Like, depending on what interpretation of quantum mechanics you're using, you can shoehorn every type of spirituality and atheism into it. And such. So how would you kind of frame the questions around quantum physics and the way people see spirituality, consciousness, and all that kind of stuff all bundled up in the conversation?
Well, I like to talk about the fact that science sometimes creates space for ideas as opposed to providing a support for ideas. I'm skeptical of claims that the laws of quantum mechanics are the vehicle for divine action.
Yes. Well, and Robert Russell's going to be on the podcast later. He can explain to both of us how persuasive that is.
Yeah.
But Russell, I agree.
Yeah. So Russell, Bob Russell's a friend of mine, and I respect him a lot. But he's very much a systematizer, and like he wants to kind of put things together in a kind of a package where science and religion kind of mesh in a well-defined way. And I mean, that's a worthy exercise, but I've become more appreciative of how deeply mysterious these questions are, and so I'm less inclined to want to take the various mysteries and package them together into a particular way of understanding things. So when I look at quantum mechanics, what I would say promote to my students would be the idea that a lot of the arguments against divine action come from a time when the scientific picture of the world was exclusively mechanical, and it was very difficult to imagine how a clock, which was the predominant metaphor, how a clock had any space for the clockmaker to kind of interact with it, that all of the little gears and chains and wheels and pulleys and so on that are inside a clock don't have any space for the clockmaker to come in and do anything there. It's so sort of intricate that any kind of intervention or interaction would be disruptive. So there once was a view like that, and in that world, it's very hard to imagine divine action. Now, quantum mechanics overturned that view. So to the degree that you exclude divine action from the universe on the basis of a mechanical metaphor, that is no longer a legitimate argument. Now, that's not to say that, therefore we now know that divine action is real, but it's simply to say this particular argument against divine action is not legitimate any longer. So there is space. And if you are convinced because of your own personal religious experience or otherwise that there is divine action, that God does interact with the world, then quantum mechanics has provided a kind of a window through which one might sort of vaguely and through a glass darkly see how God might interact with the world. So I like to kind of lay out for my students, and all this reflects my own thinking too. The complexity of these questions, the deep mysteries, the impossibility of kind of answering these questions, and the range of things that we can put on the table and say, these are things which we can accept. These are things which we must accept. These are things which we must reject. These are things which if we believe in them, we have to believe in the face of the evidence and get the students kind of appreciating complexity.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things for me, and I've been reading a lot of this since I finished my PhD because the science and philosophy stuff got interesting, and all the people I hung out with, did more of it than I did in grad school. But the idea of divine action at the quantum level, it seems to suppose that quantum mechanics is the only or primary way for God to interact with creation, and that you need to amplify these little quantum influences so that there are kind of macro physical effects. That seems, and I don't know if this is correct, to assume like that. That works if the Copenhagen theory of quantum mechanics is true, and that's contested, and only if God can occasionally look at measure particular quantum states, and at other times doesn't, which seems to still have the problem when it comes to the problem of evil and theodicy of God attending or not attending. And one of the things that one of the things that you said is, like, when you leave a mechanical universe behind, you're also leaving behind an account of the universe with causal closure, and where the most accurate description is an objective external description alone, right? Like when you talk about tell the cosmic story as a narrative and things like that, you're in a sense describing the movement and process of creation as having an internality and externality, and the quantum level divine action thing seems to try to squeeze God into a space that's not necessary, and ends up being problematic around intervention and evil issues.
Yes, and I think that the question of divine action is, I think the question of divine action really is better appreciated from the perspective that you're talking about, the problem of evil, than the nature of the universe. I mean, I think, for me, if you want to talk about divine action, you should start with the divine action itself and say, like, do we believe that there's a creator who is capable of interacting in a detailed way with everything going on in the universe? And if so, what's the basis for that? And then look at the science and say, does the science make this possible or not? And I think the problem of evil, which is, I think, one of the places where I think evangelicals have dug in their heels in ways that make it just impossible for them to really get into this conversation. And I noticed this through my time at BioLogos there, that evangelicals are just not, that they're not theologically comfortable with the idea that evil seems to be a natural feature of the world. Like the evangelical worldview kind of requires that the creation on its own terms be perfect, and that evil be this thing that intruded with sin. And that keeps them wedded to the idea of a literal Adam and Eve. It keeps the fall as an important event in history. It creates all kinds of complexities for the interpretation of evolution and the origin of human beings and life on other planets and so on. I mean, there's a whole set of kind of big questions that are shaped by that. And so I think the question of evil is an unanswerable problem. I mean, the universe is set up in such a way, and has been from the very beginning, so that the potential for terrible, terrible things to happen was there.
Well, I know in a recent book you kind of unpacked this, and previously, I know you've talked about those particular issues around a real Adam and Eve. So you have a real fall. So you have real original sin, and these type of things being so essential for evangelicals that it's hard for them to really affirm science and such. For those that grow up in a more mainline context, or in an evangelical context, that I guess not evangelical anymore, but that just assumed science was telling the truth, it's always been odd to me how those are such big issues, right? Like I never, as a person of faith, had a hard time believing human beings have some real flaw to us, and inherit patterns in a whole variety of ways that don't lead to us embodying the fullness of divine love, and that the veracity of our encounter with God, mediated by Jesus, is attached to, affirming the historicity of Adam and Eve. But even someone like Stan Grins is really vague around it, and his theology. So, like, what for you, as someone who was both in that evangelical context and then coming out of it, like when you stepped out of it, what were, those type of ideas that you go, whoa, we've been like, why have we put so much energy in protecting this? And what were those things that kind of came to the fore that you had, didn't have the energy or attention or possibility to explore?
Well, I mean, probably as you kind of alluded, the question of the historicity of Adam and Eve and so on, I became convinced that simply needed to be either completely abandoned in all respects and just turned into a kind of a parable, like the story of the prodigal son, which doesn't really need to be historical to be fully meaningful. It either needed to be sort of turned into kind of a pure myth in the traditional sense of the word, or it needed to be kind of reinterpreted out of existence in a sense. So, I mean, you can, like what you were talking about is reminiscent of the opening paragraphs in Christian Dedoux's great little book called The Genetics of Original Sin. And he writes as a non-believer, but he's a Nobel laureate in science. And I mean, he talks about like the deep insight of the Christian tradition in recognizing that there's a fundamental flaw in human nature there. And then he goes on to explain how that originated through the process of evolution and natural selection, and what he writes is compelling, and I used it in Saving Darwin as like if we want to kind of talk about sin and original sin and human nature being flawed and so on, this is the only defensible way to talk about it now. And when I wrote Saving Darwin, I was at a period where I believed that it would be possible for evangelicals to become comfortable with that based on the evidence from science, which was getting increasingly more convincing and compelling, and the arguments from geneticists and so on about how many genes there's been in the human species through time and so on, all that. But I realized, and this was a dramatic, kind of a revelatory moment for me. Like I realized that evangelicals are so wedded to that picture of a kind of original, perfect creation that's destroyed by sin that they've got to have something in history that did that. And like Dennis Alexander in his book, turns Adam and Eve into, they're Neolithic farmers in Africa, not in the Middle East. And I had a lot of conversations with the Old Testament scholar Pete Enns when he and I were together at BioLogos, and I was the vice president of BioLogos, and then the president for quite a while. So I was one of the primary architects of the message, and when we started BioLogos, we were all in agreement. I remember sitting around in Francis Collins' living room having a planning meeting before we had done anything. And we were all in agreement that the central message of BioLogos needs to be Christianity has got to find a way to get beyond a literal Adam and Eve. Francis Collins had never believed in Adam and Eve ever once in his life. And even the first time that he encountered the story as an adult, he told me that he said it didn't even occur to me that this was a story about real people. If you kind of read it as an adult who knows something about genetics, as he certainly does, the idea of two human beings 6,000 years ago in the Middle East and so on with the talking serpent and all that. The story doesn't even smack of being historical. Daryl Falk was there. He's a biologist and so on. I was there, and later on we added Pete Enns to the team and so on. So we were all in agreement about the Adam and Eve question, believing that there's no reconciling evangelical Christianity with science as long as Adam and Eve are in the picture. But that proved to be too ambitious. We were naive in thinking that, and what we found consistently was that when evangelicals discovered that was kind of where we wanted them to go, they didn't want to have anything to do with us anymore. And so when Francis Collins went to the NIH and had to step down as the head of BioLogos, and the Templeton Foundation appointed some people to reorganize and so on, well, they got rid of Pete Enns and I, precisely because we were the champions of this position that we've got to get away from a historical Adam and Eve. Pete Enns used to say that we're never going to make peace in evangelicalism on this question until we are comfortable saying the Apostle Paul believed in a literal Adam and Eve, and he was wrong. And does not believe, and I no longer believe that evangelicals can ever get there. I think that's a bridge too far, and for that reason, I don't think we are ever going to be done with this debate within the evangelical community. So I wrote a lot of books about trying to change people's minds, and then my last books are about why you can't change people's minds on this question, because we've made no progress. I mean, absolutely not. If anything, it's worse now than it was, before I wrote 11 books on this topic.
Well, I mean, in one part though, they're failing at their job. Their retention rate is not very good, and most of them send their kids, and most evangelical schools have actual scientists teaching science. You have to go to a much more conservative university to avoid it.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
To me, it just seems really weird to say, look, I know we have an inheritance of communities of people encountering the love of God through the person of Jesus, but look, if people aren't going to believe in a literal Adam and Eve, then we're going to take this ship down, because obviously the actual experience of these people over hundreds of years is completely falsified if we take science seriously. I have a hard time getting what it makes less sense to me than just, losing your biscuits about sexuality or gender or a transgender bathroom sign or something like that. This just, I don't understand.
But it is a kind of a watershed issue, I think. And I had an extremely interesting conversation with an editor, Amy Frycombe at Christian Century. She reviewed my book, Saving the Original Sinner, which was kind of the exploration of our ideas about Adam and so on over the centuries. So we were talking about the challenge within evangelicalism of fundamentalism, and I was using the description of how in the evangelical world the playing field was kind of tilted so that everything naturally slid in the direction of fundamentalism, and how the further up you went on that slope, like you had to work hard to get away from the fundamentalism, the more suspicious you became, and that evangelicals, no matter where they were on that spectrum, they were always tolerant of anybody that was to the right of them, but they were suspicious of anybody that was to the left of them. So, I mean, all those years that I was at Eastern Nazarene College, which was not at all a fundamentalist institution, nobody was ever too conservative. I mean, we would hire a creationist, and that was okay, and so on. But if you were a little bit too liberal, like, that was a problem. So you've got this kind of social phenomena where the middle of the larger spectrum of faith is a suspicious zone, a zone of suspicion, but the conservative end of the spectrum, the bottom of the slope, is kind of tolerant, and we're accepting of it. Well, so Amy Frycombe made this extremely interesting comment. She said, here at Christian Century, she said, we're just the opposite. She said, here the slope tilts the other way, and we get concerned when we see people becoming too conservative. And she gave an example of an article that somebody had written on the history of the church's views on gay marriage, and the article wasn't clear enough that gay marriage wasn't being criticized. And so they edited it because they didn't want anybody to confuse their position with the conservative position on this. And so we explored this topic a little bit, and so this picture kind of emerged of kind of a literal watershed where you've got kind of one part of the Christian demographic that's comfortable with a conversation with Richard Dawkins and Larry Krauss and so on, because they accept that science is true. We've got to take it seriously, that these big questions don't have simple answers, and so on. And we're very nervous about the people on the conservative end of the spectrum who are imposing answers that we don't think are completely defensible. And so if you are on that side of the divide, your natural trajectory is to slide in the direction of kind of agnosticism. If you're on the other side of the divide, your natural tendency is to slide in the direction of fundamentalism, and trying to kind of maintain a viable faith there in the middle is very, very difficult, and it requires a certain type of temperament. It requires an unusual type of faith community, requires a tolerance of ambiguity, and so on, that just doesn't work for very many people. And I mean, and all this is just another way of saying that we want the world to be simpler than it really is. I mean, Richard Dawkins has a very simple worldview, and Ken Ham has a very simple worldview. Those define two opposite ends. I mean, if we make a complicated spectrum just one-dimensional, those are two ends of a spectrum. Both of them kind of simple. Both of them, I think, wrong. But the place in the middle is riddled with questions and pitfalls and complexity, and we don't like that, except certain peculiar types of academics.
Well, and I can't remember who said it once, but that, you know, if forced to choose, people, the easiest way to figure out you know, where people are deepest is ask them to decide: do you want to move to rural Kansas or Berkeley? And and almost everybody knows which one they're going to pick, and that's revelatory of a lot of other parts of their.
Well, you know, I had a question that I started asking people when I became kind of alarmed at the way that evangelicalism had become so judgmental, and even in some cases a bit kind of hateful. I started asking some of my evangelical friends a closely related question. I said, if you had the choice to live in two very different communities, you've got to move to a new job, you've got to uproot, and you've got two communities which you want to pick from, and they're identical in all respects. Everything is the same. The only difference is one of them has a populace that's 95% evangelical, and the other one has a population that's 95% atheist. Which one would you choose to live in? Now, I'm posing this question to evangelicals, or people who have spent their life in the evangelical world. And 100% of the answers were, I'd rather live in the community with atheists because they would be nicer. 100%. So even people who've spent a lifetime in the evangelical world and are comfortable and familiar with it and so on have recognized that those people aren't nice anymore, if they ever were.
Yeah, that's sad.
That's very sad.
I was a church planter's kid, so I was always at a church with my parents. So it wasn't until I went to college that I realized that not everyone's experience of the church was, this is the place where, you know, learning, growth, maturity was encouraged, where you learn to get politically active, work for racial reconciliation, create communities that welcome across difference. And you do it because Jesus thinks it's a good idea. I got to college and I realized there were people that debated whether women could preach. And I was like, really? Oh,
yeah.
That's funny, because we were Baptists, but you know, that didn't stop me from shock. And so I constantly run up against this awareness that my relationship to the church is significantly more positive than a lot of my peers. And it's sad because I'm like, it definitely doesn't have to be this way.
No, it doesn't have to be, but it's become that way, and there doesn't seem to be light on the horizon. Like it's just hard to imagine how we get from here to a better place. And I now have among my students at Stonehill, I had a very good student just this fall semester who stated quite clearly that on moral grounds, I reject Christianity, and I do not want to be identified as a Christian because I consider that would be to tarnish me with an immoral label.
Mm-hmm.
That would, and I thought that's very clear, but that's very damning to kind of not want the label because it's immoral.
Yeah,
and when you unpack that within conversation, I mean, you can say you see that, the abuse in the church, the anti-science, the treatment of gays, the treatment of immigrants, and so on. I mean, all this stuff, like you look at it and you say, like, do I want to be a part of that? And, for me, the answer increasingly became no. I don't want to wear the public face of evangelicalism any longer.
Yeah. And in what, I know you mentioned this earlier before we started recording, but like, how would you describe the power of censure and editing and limitation of speech for those in an evangelical context? Because currently you have Fox News and Company blowing up every time someone doesn't want a Nazi sympathizer speaking at their church, at their school or whatever. And free speech is becoming this pin chant of the right. But one of the things Tom Ord, who I think will have just been on the podcast when this comes out, have both experienced the silent yet extremely heavy hand of evangelical censure.
Yeah, and when I was dealing with the sort of preliminary marketing of my book, Saving the Original Sinner, which was all about the Adam and Eve question, one of the first things that you do is you get celebrity endorsements for your back cover that people can notice and hopefully decide to read it. So I decided that I would get endorsements from people who had been fired from evangelical colleges for their beliefs in Adam and Eve and evolution. And, so I had Pete Enns, who was fired from Westminster Theological Seminary after a distinguished career there. John Schneider, who was fired from Calvin College, specifically because of a paper he wrote about Adam and Eve. Richard Colling, who was fired from Olivet Nazarene University, and so on. And although I wasn't technically fired, I was aggressively pushed to depart from Eastern Nazarene, and a big part of that was my championing of evolution, and so on. And you've mentioned Tom Ord, and there's just a lot of people. And I mean, because these institutions are small, and most of us are not kind of household names, we don't make big news when it happens. But if you take the collection of people who have lost their jobs over theological questions in evangelical schools, it's a long list. It's a very long list, and in a lot of cases, it's almost impossible to find additional employment. I mean, I was very lucky to do that, but I have colleagues, including some of the people that I mentioned, that either went for years without employment or never did find full-time academic employment again. So it's not the case that you can just, like people would say, why don't you just go teach at some other institution? Well, like you can't go from an evangelical institution to another one without some really good luck there, because once you're tarnished with the label sort of heretic, as we all were, then that you carry that. You carry that with you. So I think there's a very real sense in which people do actually lose their jobs, which is significant. There's also a sense in which you are forced to teach in a certain way and remain quiet about certain things, and you are expected to project an endorsement of the party line. And so, like, I had many colleagues over the years at Eastern Nazarene who were absolutely supportive of the LGBT community and very disappointed that the Church of the Nazarene and evangelicalism in general was not supportive of that community, and were acting in ways that were hostile and alienating, and so on. But you can't say that. And if you dared to say it, you could get fired. And one of my colleagues, outstanding teacher who was an alum at Eastern Nazarene, taught there for many years, he lost his job because he would not condemn gay marriage in his social work classes when the topic came up. So I think there's a very real sense in which people are muzzled consistently by the mission statements there. And I don't know. I mean, I've never seen any statistical study of this, but like I would guess that you are more likely to lose your job in an evangelical school for speaking out on some of these controversial issues than you are in a secular university to lose your job for stating something that was politically incorrect and so on. I mean, there aren't a lot of examples of people that the language police have gotten fired from more liberal secular institutions. Now that's not to say that I don't think that this is a big problem, but in secular institutions, but I do think that in Fox News is, it's interesting that Fox News is making a fuss about this, and I've heard this. Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly, and they make this fuss all the time, but they kind of created the very problem that they're talking about. I mean, they showed from a marketing point of view how if you are a loudmouth and you just make provocative, hostile statements, you can make a very good living. And that's what Sean Hannity does every night on Fox. He's very uninformed, very poorly educated. He's never had a real original idea of any sort. But people like Sean Hannity and Ann Coulter and so on, they just make a living by making offensive statements, which I don't think they even believe themselves. I think they just know that this is happening. And so when they defend the right of a neo-Nazi to speak at a liberal school and so on, essentially they're just rationalizing their own position because they're not that different than the neo-Nazi stating right-wing nonsense that's offensive to a lot of people there. So we're at this sort of juncture where I think that the progress that the LGBT community has made, I think the Me Too movement and a whole lot of things have kind of come together in a way that marginalized minority constituencies are now empowered to assert themselves. And the way that they're inserting themselves is often with the labeling. Like they say, I reject the label faggot, homo. Like, no, they don't call me that, and so on. And so the Sean Hannity's of the world will kind of still keep wanting to use that and then take offense when you object to it. So I feel like I'm rambling here a little bit, but when I've had these conversations with my students, in particular about, say, like the Me Too movement and some of the things surrounding race, they are very sophisticated. I was very impressed with how clear this generation is in their thinking about the importance not offending people with your language or your actions, and being willing to let formerly marginalized groups have an authentic voice. And so I think when people like this guy Milo, I can't pronounce his last name, but like this Milo fellow, I mean, like he's just making a living offending people, right? I mean, Ann Coulter is the same way. Like these are not people who bring ideas to the table. I mean, Ann Coulter doesn't have ideas; she just has provocative statements, and so she wants to go to a college campus and get a big honorarium and generate a lot of controversy, but never present an idea worth discussion. And so there's a certain sense in which a college should be open to all forms of legitimate ideas.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean you should let any spokesperson for any position who may or may not have something worthwhile to say on your stage.
Well, one of the things you said just then about your students echoes something I've heard from multiple professors that interact at historically evangelical, especially undergrads, that they're much more optimistic about the 2 generations out, right? That the leadership that is being formed now are not internalizing the battles their parents and grandparents thought were definitional.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And I have a good friend who has 2 twin daughters, age 17, and she will speak often about. Now they grew up in the Boston area, so kind of it's a liberal part of the country, but like their generation, like they're all done with this conversation about the LGBT community. Like there's no space at all for any argument that gays should not be allowed to get married, should not be allowed to adopt children, and so on. I mean, in their view, this is a settled part of social justice, and we are not going to we're not going to even keep the conversation alive. We're kind of done with it. And and I think, I mean, there's a very real sense in which it is not prudent or open-minded to keep talking about whether the earth is flat or whether the earth moves around the sun or whether the earth is 6,000 years old. I mean, those are not ideas that in the name of open-mindedness deserve a hearing anymore because they've been refuted.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So some of these views that people like Milo and others want to get onto the table, and Coulter, these are not ideas that have any currency any longer. I mean, they're just wrong ideas. They've been proven wrong, and so on. And there's nothing prejudicial about saying we're not going to give these ideas a forum in the academy because they're stupid ideas, and we don't engage stupid ideas in the academy.
Well, one of the things that strikes me, and I mean, I don't know, I haven't got a tenured position to know what this would feel like, but I have been a minister and been asked questions where my answers cost me opportunities. But the number of people that train evangelical ministers I've interviewed, where I get an email afterwards saying, I don't think you should air this conversation we had, or can you edit out these parts? Because it becomes very clear in 2 people that respect each other talking that they're like the literal Adam and Eve question, or a full inclusion, or climate change, or that if you read Jesus, you should probably advocate on behalf of immigrants and economic justice, or things like that.
Yeah.
The level of silence and that our peers have, that where they're, as a vocational educator and person of the faith, where you silence your genuine Christian commitments to preserve a position that continues to support and fund an institution that is doing violence to the planet, the poor, and the marginalized. I don't get. Like I bet if there was a vote in the science departments and the religion departments across evangelical colleges, universities, divinity schools, seminaries, that on these issues, they'd believe it was rigged, because you end up with very thoughtful, critical thinking evangelicals in those positions who just don't hold to those old ideas like people funding the endowments think they do.
Yeah, exactly. And there's an interesting pattern with people like Tom Ord and Pete Enns and myself, who kind of all experience the same thing. And that derives exactly from what you're talking about, that as long as you remain in obscurity, you can kind of be an outspoken liberal within evangelicalism. I mean, I have colleagues, like I during my tenure at Eastern Nazarene, like I was not more liberal than my colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
I actually had, I had colleagues there who, if you got them to talk quietly and off the record, like they would tell you, yeah, we don't believe in the virgin birth anymore. I mean, we understand how that language got into the text, and it's not really about a virgin birth, but they won't say that in their classroom. I had one colleague who was at Eastern Nazarene for several years who didn't believe that the resurrection was a physical resurrection. And again, he had a complicated theological view of that. But they wouldn't state those things in the classroom. And as long as they didn't write books and go out and speak in public on that stuff, they're fine. And they could even, with sort of seniors in their department, after some trust had been developed and so on, they could even kind of explore those ideas in the classroom, because within that community, there was space for that, just like what you're talking about. But as soon as you start writing a book, then everybody under the sun can read it. And so some poorly educated fundamentalist pastor with some influence starts to make a stink, some notoriety results, and pretty soon you've got this constituency calling for your head. And that's what got Pete Enns fired from Westminster. That's what got Tom Ord fired from NNU. And that's what got me in trouble at Eastern Nazarene. It's this kind of larger public persona that you get, where people outside the academy, in many cases connected to donors, maybe in all cases, where they begin to see exactly what's going on, and they're not happy with it. And so they do the age-old thing of put financial pressure on institutions, and that kind of pressure seems to win.
I mean, I just think it's instructive for people to. There are two things about it. One is the actual people that evangelicalism are creating, like the humans that have been blessed by them and are carrying that tradition and faith vocationally every day into a classroom to educate its future leaders, are not concerned about the issues that a lot of them are hung up on, and actually have very strong Christian convictions otherwise. And the other side of it is that I think, as leaders in congregations and in academic institutions, you just have to think if you're okay with the culpability of continued silence. Because I don't, because of the podcast, I've interacted with lots of ministers who are at large churches. They come to be open and affirming, and then in their silence, they're trying to figure out, how do I share this with the church? Do I lead them along? What do I do?
Yep.
And I've had multiple, relationships with people. I'm encouraging them and stuff. And I realized after one of them had a member in their very large church commit suicide, because they assumed the pastor hadn't said anything about homosexuality in years, because he had changed his mind, but just assumed that the silent judgment of evangelicalism was shared by everyone in the room, that God wasn't allowing them to change, and so she took her life. And it was after that, like, I thought, how many kids and teenagers are hurting themselves, and how many parents don't want their kid to be honest with them because they don't want to admit, what's there. So, like, the silence on a lot of these issues actually are impediments to genuine faith. And it impedes people coming to know themselves as known and loved by God. And the silence and slow playing of so many leaders is a real ethical predicament. I don't I haven't been able to make sense of.
Yeah, I mean, I had an experience that that resonated with that. I mentioned earlier in our conversation that you had to be kind of silent on the LGBT question at Eastern Nazarene College, and after I left Eastern Nazarene and was free to be open about that, I quickly established myself as fully in support of that community, and so on. And I had a former student of mine that, and I'd only had him for one class, but he had appreciated the course and so on. And he contacted me on Facebook privately, and he sent me this heartbreaking message where he gave me the actual date and time in which he had made the decision that he was going to take his own life. And this was when he was in college, he had wrestled with the fact that he was gay, and he was going to one of those Exodus weekends where you pray away the gay, and he had made up his mind that he couldn't live with this anymore, and that if he was still gay after this weekend where he was seeking a miracle, that at 7:00 on that Monday night he was going to take his own life. Now, obviously, he didn't, or he couldn't have sent me that message. Needless to say, the pray away the gay weekend didn't work, and he remains a gay man who's now comfortable with that. But when I read that, it was almost like a physical wave of guilt washed over me, and all of a sudden I had that sense, and you used the word complicit. Like, that was what I felt like. I thought, the Church of the Nazarene has persecuted this community relentlessly for its entire existence, and the institutions have made members of that community uncomfortable, self-loathing, have pushed them into bogus, harmful activities like pray away the gay weekends, and so on. And I was silent. And there was something clarifying. There was something clarifying about that, to kind of come to the realization that an institution, which at its heart would maybe be a noble institution fighting for social justice at some level, trying to follow the teachings of Jesus, but yet in practice would be driving young people to take their own lives because of persecution. And at that point, I just was so clear that I couldn't be a part of anything like that any longer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a powerful story. And I wonder if, especially connected to science, if in a couple generations we won't feel the same way about the environmental crisis that's coming.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a half century or so, when it becomes impossible to deny that the planet is doing so poorly, I think we will look back at the GOP, we will look back at evangelicalism, we will look back at the oil industry the way that today we look back at the Nazis and say, how could they have done what they did, and so on. I mean, I think that what's going on now will eventually be recognized as a genuinely evil, project to kind of oppose addressing climate change, and there'll be a lot of suffering that will come from that. But like at one level, I kind of hope that's true, because that will mean that a certain type of enlightenment has become more universal. But I'm reminded of the fact that when I go back to the mid '80s, when I was a junior faculty member, my senior colleagues thought that I was a little bit rambunctious in my concern about evolution, And they just thought, well, like this collection of ideas that the earth is 10,000 years old and that Noah's flood was universal and so on, that evolution is not true like this. These ideas will just die on their own. These are terrible ideas. And we don't really need to expend any energy fighting them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here we are now 30 years later, and those ideas, if anything, are stronger than they were. So I don't know. I hope climate change becomes something that we're more comfortable with in time in the Christian community, but I don't know. I wonder if we're being naive.
Well, let's hope you're not being too naive, because I'm all supportive of my grandkids breathing well.
Yeah, and those of us that are educated enough and not wedded to some ideology that blinds us to the reality certainly are all on the same page with that. But there's a very kind of sinister anti-intellectualism that is working now in evangelicalism, where the need to defend the faith against ideas like evolution, say, has created a whole intellectual machinery for how you dismantle kind of compelling scientific arguments, or just compelling arguments in general. And what we see going on in the climate conversation in evangelicalism is absolutely identical to what's been going on with evolution for 3/4 of a century. That what you do is you go and you find the few oddball, exceptional facts, and you constantly present them as if they are typical. And you find the few eccentric scientists who are outside the mainstream, and you present them as if they represent like the other side, as if there's a kind of polarization on the issue. And evolution in the past half century has gotten stronger and stronger and stronger, and the evidence is getting better and better and better. And evangelicals are no closer now to accepting it than they were 75 years ago. I mean, if anything, they're less likely to accept it. And so I fear that what will happen will be that the opponents of climate science will simply become ever more adept at keeping the faithful from accepting climate science. I hope I'm wrong about that, but I was wrong about evolution. I mean, even in a relatively small non-fundamentalist denomination like the Church of the Nazarene, and I published my first book with the Nazarene Publishing House. I got probably the most well-respected theologian in the denomination to write a foreword to the book, and we put his name on the front cover. I got prominent Nazarenes to endorse the book, and so on. Got it reviewed in the denominational magazine. I mean, like, I did everything possible to make this kind of first project promoting evolution to Nazarenes to be successful, and there's no evidence that it had any influence at all. I mean, there's a lot of individual anecdotes here and there. Lots of people said, "Oh, I love the book; it really helped me a lot," and so I know that individuals were helped. But in terms of the institution of the Church of the Nazarene becoming more accepting of evolutionary science, that didn't happen.
Mm-hmm. So maybe for a last question, one of the things I'd be interested in are 3 books you would recommend for someone who is interested in any part of the religion and science conversation as places to begin to broaden their perspective and such.
Well, I think that one of the depending on the kind of academic background of the person, a very valuable book that can be read by an undergraduate, but is can be a little bit challenging. Is John Hedley Brooke wrote a book called Science and Religion: Some Historical Perspectives, and I mean I think that a first pass through this topic needs to focus on dismantling some of the historical mythology surrounding the warfare between science and religion. So it's very, very helpful, I think, especially for a religious believer, to kind of realize that the notion that science and religion are implacably hostile to each other and have always been so, and there's something intrinsic to their epistemologies that makes that a perennial problem, that's not true. But almost everybody believes that. I mean, I find that at Isha Nazarene, I thought, well, this is fundamentalist propaganda that's being absorbed by my students. But my students at Stonehill College are from liberal Catholic homes, and they all think that. I mean, everybody thinks that science and religion are just perennially at war. So I think Hedley Brooke's book, Science and Religion: Some Historical Perspectives, is a great book to dismantle that. A slightly less challenging book on the same topic would be, it's an anthology, Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion, that was edited by Ron Numbers. But they both make the same sort of argument. I think Francis Collins' book, The Language of God, is a really helpful book for evangelicals. Being a kind of ex-evangelical myself, I don't find the theological arguments that he's making in there to be as clear-cut and obvious as I once did. But if you're inclined to come at this from an evangelical perspective, I think that is a very, very good place to start. And and another book that I found very helpful when I was trying desperately to kind of stay within evangelicalism and be kind of intellectually comfortable there was John Polkinghorne's Gifford Lectures, published under the name The Faith of a Physicist. And I liked what Polkinghorne did there, where he looked at kind of traditional creedal affirmations through the eyes of a scientist. And I mean, I say through the eyes of a scientist, but that's not to say that you need to be a scientist to appreciate the discussion, because in our culture, the language that we've adopted for the most part in speaking about facts and so on is a kind of scientific language. I mean, we like, even though we're kind of scientifically illiterate on the one hand, our language and our way of looking at the world and so on has been so shaped by science that I think most people will find the way that Polkinghorne writes to be a more congenial, familiar way of discussing things than the way that a traditional theologian, for example, would write, because we no longer speak in the language of theology. I mean, we don't speak about mythology in the way that theologians would, for example, there. So,
And what if someone was interested in the conversation we had earlier about physics? Like, where's a place to begin to get a grasp of contemporary conversations around physics?
Well, I mean, at the risk of being self-promoting, I really think my book with InterVarsity Press, The Wonder of the Universe, is a really good place to kind of start with that, because I wrote that kind of as a part of the BioLogos project, and so it was written kind of explicitly to evangelicals who were trying to get out of the fundamentalist mindset, and so on. And and I tried to raise all the questions that I think somebody would bring to that topic there. But there are a lot of books on this physics question. But I mean, I think in terms of accessibility, one of the problems with the physics part of this conversation is it's just so horrendously complicated to get even a simple idea into like comprehensible form. I mean, that's a real challenge. And many of the books, I mean, like I read Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time, which was a bestseller. Like I didn't understand it. I mean that book is, invokes levels of it's not a mathematical book, but it invokes a very advanced set of concepts that without a lot of background you can't really make sense of them. And you can read the words and understand them, but in terms of really getting the concepts. And so what I tried really hard with in The Wonder of the Universe was I tried to take these ideas and get them at the level where a college freshman would come away saying, okay, I didn't get it all, but I do see, what we mean by the fine tuning. Because most of those books presume a background and level of interest that most people don't have.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you tons for taking the time. I've enjoyed talking with you immensely.
Well, I enjoyed the conversation as well. It's always fun to kind of review one's life journey and intellectual pathways and so on. So this was fun.
So what is on your horizon? What will we be reading of yours next?
Well, I've got a couple of small writing assignments. I'm doing an article on Christianity and science for a set of encyclopedias that will be covering kind of the broad question of Christianity and culture. Going to do something there. I'm working on I've agreed to do a piece on Newton and the Bible. So that will be fun. I just received an email asking me to do a piece on what we were talking about earlier, the divine action and quantum theory. I haven't decided if I want to do that yet because I have a somewhat dim view of how theologians are using that notion, but you can talk to Bob Russell about that. But I might do that one as well. Also, been working for a couple of years on a novel, but I don't know whether I'll ever get that into print or not. But after 11 non-fictional books, I'm kind of interested in branching out. So those are the things. But the question you asked is actually somewhat more complicated because it brings up the fact that having gone to a liberal Catholic school from an evangelical school, the need for the particular arguments that I've been working on in print for several years is just very different. Like my new community doesn't need ways to think about evolution and sin that work within their theological frameworks because they don't ask those questions.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know you're a Star Trek fan, so you can always write about science, Star Trek, philosophy, and stuff. That's always fun.
That's always fun. Absolutely. Yep.
And you know what? Market never turns its back on you or Trekkies. They're like if you're a Trekkie, the solidarity is immense.
Well, maybe we need a book on the sort of Star Trek and its journey into truth.
Yeah, there's not a lot of ex-Trek Vandicals or whatever.
Yes.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I hope you have a great day.
Yep. Okay, you too, and thanks for the conversation.